Here's an important question on divorce and remarriage. I have a question about one of your sermons from a little while ago. It's the part of the Bible where Jesus talks about divorce. He basically says that any man who marries a woman who is divorced is committing adultery. And I believe you said in your sermon that depending on where people are in their lives, married, divorced, etc., they should stay where they are. My question, if someone is divorced and remarried, is that person committing adultery every day? So very important question, very practical question. What happens if a person has been remarried unbiblically? Is that an ongoing condition of adultery? Because we would not want that, right? So should that person separate from their spouse, or should that person stay remarried and be obedient in their current marriage? And some arguments have been made by some people who say, no, they should separate because the word commit adultery is kind of an imperfect tense, which means ongoing. Now, that's a fair point, but the imperfect tense could also just be referencing the marriage itself. So I think the best text that actually is the most helpful in addressing this is actually Deuteronomy 21. This is the Old Testament text where Moses allows for divorce in certain situations. But one of the things he says there in Deuteronomy 21 is he forbids the returning to a previous spouse after remarriage, suggesting that breaking a second marriage is not actually God's will. And I think this is probably the most clear text in addressing this issue, that the second marriage is a legitimate marriage. Even if the situation is not ideal, even if the situation was sinful. And this makes sense because this is not the only situation we're talking about. If we were talking about the fact that entering into a marriage sinfully would require the person to be divorced, well, then what about a person who is an unbeliever, who entered into a marriage and had an unbiblical divorce prior to his coming to Christ, or committed adultery prior to coming to Christ, had many extramarital affairs prior to coming to Christ, but now is married? What is he supposed to do as he comes to Christ? Is he supposed to divorce his wife? So it applies to many more situations other than this. And I think the Bible's broad answer to this question is that we are only held accountable to the knowledge that we know. But once we understand what God's requirements are for our life, we are now accountable to apply those in as best way we can. I do think that even marriages enter into sinfully are legitimate marriages, which is why every unbeliever's marriage is a legitimate marriage. God is not the center of that marriage, but it is still a marriage in God's eyes. So I don't think that that having some sort of purity prior to marriage makes the marriage real. I think that it is the covenant act before God and before witnesses that makes the marriage real. That's the issue. And so hopefully that gives some clarity on that issue, but it is a sticky one and has tremendous ramifications. So we need to think carefully about it.